We were sitting one night in bed watching TV, and she turned and looked at me and said, "Are you rubbing my hair?" And I said, "No." And I turned and looked, and I watched her hair swirl like somebody's finger was in her hair, but there was nothing there. There was no air conditioning on. There was no fan. There was no wind. Her hair literally was moving by itself.
With its dense forest and mist-covered mountains, North Carolina has long been fertile ground for petrifying tales of witches. These are women who, down through the ages, have been both revered and feared for their supernatural powers. And they aren't the types who ride brooms through the night sky wearing black hats. No, they are far more disturbing. Welcome to First in Fright, where we explore eerie legends, supernatural tales, and everything that goes bump in the North Carolina night. I'm your host, Cooper Thornton. This is Episode 6, Old North Witches. Our local storyteller begins with two of the most intriguing and harrowing witch tales North Carolina has ever produced. But a note of caution. These kinds of stories can be very difficult to hear. Historically, the oppression of witches were part of a long-standing attempt by men to maintain their power. Let's start at Brownrigg Mill in Chowan County, which was built in 1762 and operated for nearly 2 centuries before catching fire and burning to the ground in the late 1960s. But even though it was consumed by ravenous flames, one of the most terrifying accounts of what happened there survived unscathed. This is the Witch of Brownrigg Mill.
Timothy Farrell operated the Brownrigg Mill, but the miller could not muster anything but apathy. It's not that he cared nothing for the plight of his fellow colonists or for the future of his fledgling country, but he moved through each day in a sort of trance, a hollow shell of who he was before the loss of his beloved wife Anna, just over a year earlier. Now, people came from near and far to have him grind their corn and their flour, and he was widely known as the finest miller in the county. But these days, between the drudgery of work and the suffocating responsibility of raising his young daughter Elizabeth all alone, well, Timothy did not have the time nor the fortitude to care about anything beyond what was right in front of him. The only solace he found was after he closed the mill doors and he took his fishing pole down to the mill pond. There, beside the glittering water and an impenetrable forest so dark as to send apprehensive shudders down his spine, well, there, Timothy was able to steal a few moments of unfettered happiness. Now, on this particular day, as he watched for the familiar tug of his line, he noticed a small shape on the far distant side of the pond. A canoe was emerging from the tightly packed trees, and it appeared to be floating his way. Who on earth was brave enough to risk their soul in that dark wood? As the boat drew closer, Timothy thought he spied an old haggard crone, but as it nestled to the shore, he realized the woman was actually spectacularly beautiful. She had raven black hair, she had eyes the color of emeralds, and her skin was as white as polished porcelain. "I have traveled far," the woman said in a honeyed voice, "and I was hoping you might give me food and lodging for the night." Oh, Timothy didn't answer her directly. He was too smitten to locate his tongue. But as soon as he'd composed himself, he ardently agreed to her request. He intended to ask her why she'd been in the dark woods across the way, but his inquiry was suddenly forgotten. Timothy's body was jolted with a powerful charge as he took her hand in his own, and he led her to his small cottage on the knoll above the mill. The woman, well, she said her name was Fay, and that night, over a simple meal of stew and cider. She regaled Timothy and Elizabeth with tales of ancient Egypt, Rome, and Greece. Her stories were so dense with detail and intoxicating spice, Timothy almost believed she had lived in those lands herself. And by the time he had cleared the plates, Timothy was in love. And now it wasn't quite the same with Elizabeth. She did not recoil from this stranger. However, something within her kept the woman beyond arm's reach. Timothy reckoned, there'll be plenty of time for intimacy to bloom later. His daughter needed a mother, and he yearned for female companionship again. Well, late that night, Timothy proposed, and Faye accepted. It wasn't long before they were married, and she took up residence with him in the mill house. Right away, Timothy's life blossomed. He found fresh vigor and joy in his work, and he looked forward to the end of each day and the finely prepared food and company awaiting him once he got home. His transformation was so complete that his neighbors frequently commented about how astonished they were at his metamorphosis. But then, and he didn't know why, people stopped coming to his mill. Not all at first, but enough that the miller became confused. His work and his word were better than they had ever been. And that's when he began to hear whispers in town, rumors about his beautiful Faye. Many in the community found her behavior deeply strange and off-putting. She wasn't natural, they said. No woman could be this learned, this shrewd in the ways of the world. Where was she from, and how did she come by all of these experiences and stories? Timothy dismissed their gossip. Surely it was just the ramblings of jealous and spiteful wives. But soon, the women of the community who had spoken out against Faye the loudest, they found their cattle grew sick and died. And those who had persisted in maligning her woke up one day, to discover their children had gone to bed fit and healthy, but had died of some pestilence in their sleep. Well, as the townsfolk realized that only those who spoke out against the newcomer came down with dreadful afflictions, they became convinced that Faye was a witch. Now, some of Timothy's neighbors confronted him at his home one day, demanding to interrogate the sorceress. They stormed into the mill house. They threw open the door to his bedroom. But Faye was not there. It was only a wide, cooling crater in the bedsheet where a large cat had clearly been sleeping only minutes earlier. That was strange, because Timothy had no cat. For his part, the miller was indignant, and when his friends demanded that he cast his wife out, he railed against their asinine superstitions. It was time for this foolishness to end. Well, soon, nearly all the townsfolk began taking their corn and their flour to other grist mills, even though the journey was longer and the product was poorer. Timothy was unsure what to do. He loved his new wife. But without his community's support, there was no way he would be able to provide for her and for Elizabeth. Now, Timothy was eternally grateful to those few headstrong members of the community who continued to bring him their business. But one day, his great grindstone toppled from its holdings and crashed to the mill floor. There was only one explanation. His jealous neighbors had snuck into his mill and sabotaged his equipment in an attempt to ruin him. No doubt they would try it again. But this time, Timothy swore he would be ready for them. He intended to keep watch all night. He would hide behind some bags of feed, and when they appeared, he would catch them in the act. That night, dark, roiling storm clouds gathered on the horizon, and Timothy concluded the townspeople would almost certainly use the coming downpour to finish the job they had started. As he lay in wait, a terrific storm broke. Lightning carved the sky into pieces, and the thunder, well, it was so loud that Timothy wondered if there'd be anything standing when the mob arrived. It began raining so hard that the muddy roadways became rivers, raging rivers. And that's when Timothy heard the sound. A cacophony of wretched caterwauls rising in volume and proximity as if every cat in the Carolinas had suddenly mustered outside his mill. Well, beyond the mill doors, many somethings began clawing and scratching at the wood, and before Timothy knew what was going on, they swung the door open. And dozens upon dozens of the largest black cats Timothy had ever seen surged inside. Their ears were pressed flat against their heads. The hair on their arched backs stood straight up. Their tails lashed this way and that, and their fanged mouths emitted sharp, long hisses. They surrounded Timothy, and one at a time they rushed and attacked him, scratching at his face and tearing his flesh and his clothing. He was soon bloodied and exhausted. He was unable to defend himself, but he saw it in the corner, a nearby axe. He grabbed for it just as the largest of the cats launched itself at him. One great paw, its razor-sharp claws gleaming under a ribbon of angry lightning, bore down. Well, Timothy quickly jumped aside, and he brought his axe down in one fluid motion. The cat howled, enraged in agony, and then it turned and ran awkwardly off into the night. The other cats shrieked their displeasure and followed it out into the soggy darkness. There at Timothy's feet was a massive paw, carved clean off. Timothy raced back to his cottage. He could barely stay upright as the onslaught of water gushed down the hill. He burst into his bedroom, and that's where he found his beautiful wife lying on their bed, curled up in pain. Dark, wet blood was fast soaking the bedsheets. And where her right hand should have been, there was now just the grotesque and misshapen stump. When she saw her husband, Faye rose with a primal hiss and transformed before his eyes into the same giant black cat he had just fought in the mill. And with an almost human look of regret and rage, it hobbled quickly out of the room. In an instant, Timothy realized his customers had been right. His wife was a shape-shifting witch. It was she who had been driving his customers away, and it was she who had sabotaged his machinery. Timothy raced outside to follow her, but as he did, he was swept away by the gathering flood, and he was washed, flailing, into the frothing mill pond. His body was discovered floating there the next day. The townspeople said his face bore a look of absolute terror, and in his clenched fist, he still held tight to the severed paw of a large black cat.
Our next tale takes place only 100 miles away from Brownrigg Mill and is part of Gullah folklore, which comes from the descendants of West and Central African slaves brought to the lower Atlantic states. Gullah stories are filled with wisdom and warnings which were passed down from generation to generation through the antebellum period, the dark slavery years, emancipation, Reconstruction, Jim Crow segregation to today. And there is no more legendary Gullah tale than that of the Boo Hag.
Once there were two friends who lived in Newbern, along the banks of the Neuse River in the central part of eastern North Carolina. The war between the states was over, and Newbern had been flooded by newly freed men and women who dreamed of creating a bright future for themselves. Two of those men were named Abe and Isaiah. Now, Abe was married to his sweetheart, and their house was filled with the laughter of young children. But Isaiah, well, he was a bachelor. His mother despaired of him ever taking a wife. It's not that Isaiah didn't want to marry and settle down. He was desperate to find love. But no woman had yet accepted his advances. Well, that was until he met Celia. She was a young midwife, newly from Wilmington. She was beautiful. She had dark umber skin. She had large, bright eyes, and she had a smile that made Isaiah's knees buckle. Oh, he fell in love with her, and he was surprised when she returned his affections. Oh, theirs was a passionate affair, and to the surprise and delight of Isaiah's friends and family, they were soon wed. What followed was a period of pure euphoria. Celia kept Isaiah's house clean, and her wonderful meals were warm and satisfying. Abe would regularly find his dear friend lost in thought. Isaiah would have a grin from ear to ear. "I know what you're thinking about," Abe would say, and Isaiah would just laugh. But as time went on, Isaiah's smile began to fade. One day, Abe asked his friend, "Hey, are you okay? How are you doing?" Isaiah looked at Abe and asked a question he had been thinking about for a long time. "Is your wife with you when you wake in the middle of the night?" "Of course," Abe said, perplexed. "Why do you ask?" "Well, because when I blow out our candle each night, Celia is beside me. And when I rise with the sun each morning, she is there. But if I wake in the dark, my bed is empty." Oh, this puzzled both men greatly, and they agreed that they needed to visit old Hester. Hester was the conjure woman who lived by herself down by the swamp. Now, a conjure woman? She was the person everyone went to when they had problems they could not solve. Oh, she knew all the hoodoo magic, and her herbs had healed many a sick child. Isaiah and Abe expected Hester to laugh and say they were just overreacting. But the old woman grew very serious, and her eyes blazed. "Honey, you have married a Boo Hag." "What's a Boo Hag?" Isaiah said. "A Boo Hag? That's a witch. That's a shape-shifter. She doesn't have her own skin. No. So she must borrow someone else's. She peels her skin off each night, and then she flies around looking for unsuspecting victims, and when she finds one, she descends upon them, and she steals the breath from their lungs. A Boo Hag is the last thing you ever want to cross, boy, and you surely don't want to be married to one." Isaiah was stunned. "Well, what do I do?" "You must pretend to sleep tonight. And then you wait. You wait until the Boo Hag slips out of her skin and goes out into the night. And when she does, you search the house for her skin, and once you have found it, you must cover it with salt and pepper. If you do as I say, she will be unable to return to her skin. Do what I say, boy." That night, Isaiah did as he was instructed. He pretended to fall asleep, but when he felt his wife climb from their marriage bed, he quietly followed her to the attic. He watched from the shadows as she peeled the human flesh from her body. Underneath was a slimy, hideous creature throbbing with red muscles and crisscrossed with blue veins. The creature that was his wife sprang from the window and lifted off, disappearing into the darkness. Isaiah recoiled at the sight. He threw up on the floor. Oh, it was several minutes before he was able to compose himself. That thing was his beautiful Celia. He cleaned up the mess, and then he retrieved Celia's skin from where she had hidden it in an old trunk in the corner of the room. And as Hester had charged him, he salted and peppered the skin. He rolled it up, and he carefully put it back just as he had found it. And then he went back to bed, and he waited. Early the next morning, Isaiah heard his wife return. There was a noisy commotion in the attic, and Isaiah could hear his Boo wife cursing and fretting as she tried to climb back into her sabotaged skin. And then eventually he felt her crawl back into the bed beside him. Something wet brushed against his naked legs. What was that, he thought. When the sun rose, Isaiah climbed out of bed and he made his wife a large meal. "It's time to get up. I've made you breakfast." But Celia said she was too ill to rise. She had completely covered herself with the sheet and she refused to budge. "It's all right, my love. I'll go fetch the doctor for you." Even as his wife began to protest, Isaiah sprinted to Hester's shack, and together with Abe, the three of them returned to his house. Hester looked at the woman. "What ails you, child?" When Celia did not answer, Hester tore the sheets off the bed, revealing the skinless golem. "That, my boys," Hester said, "that is a Boo Hag." Together, the three bound Celia up, and they carried her into the swamp, where they left her fate to God and the alligators.
Modern scholars see the Boo Hag less as a symbol of evil and more of the enslaved and marginalized woman's need to escape the social confines required of her and seek out new sources of energy and life in order to feed her weary body and soul. Seen in this light, the Boo Hag might just be heroic. But the witch in our next story is no hero, quite the opposite. In the early 20th century, the Tuckertown witch cast a sinister spell that's still wreaking havoc today, 100 years later. Just ask Stacy, a local resident whose life was turned upside down by a curse so powerful that even a modern-day witch can't break it.
I used to live in Lexington, North Carolina on High Rock Lake, which is a part of the Uwharrie Lake chain in the central part of North Carolina, a part of the Tuckertown dam system. This particular area of North Carolina has always had a darkness attached to it. A lot of death is the easiest way to say it. It has always been synonymous with accidents. In the 1920s, when they first announced that they were going to put in dams to hydroelectric the South, Tuckertown was one of the towns that was bought and the population was relocated. The Witch of Tuckertown was a lady who lived in Tuckertown and she refused to move. Now, she did have a reputation of being the old lady you would go to if you were sick or you wanted a love potion or those kind of things. And when this occurred, she refused to move, refused to sell her land. And the last anyone saw of her was on her front porch, refusing to move, stating that she would curse the water, she would curse the land and the lake if they drowned her. No one saw her again after that. Since that time, every time that there's a mysterious drowning, people have said that something is causing it supernaturally. And they have said, it's the Witch of Tuckertown. It's her curse. She cursed the lake and said that it would always be a place of death. If you're going to kill me, you're going to die too. I know for a fact that the curse is real. My home on the banks of High Rock Lake was a place that became extraordinarily dark and frightening. In 2009, my wife and I bought a home on High Rock Lake. Everything was great for the first few months that we were there. But as we neared fall of that year, I was working outside and would feel a presence around the house. And it was in the woods. I would just be working and feel like something's watching me. Something's out there. One particular night, I was working underneath my car with a light, and it was dark, and I could hear what sounded like something moving in the gravel. And I was thinking, well, okay, somebody's walked up. And I come out from underneath the Jeep and looked around. Nobody's there. I thought, something just doesn't feel right. And later on, I went in the house, and I told my wife, I said, I feel like something's out there. And she was like, okay, well, let's kind of keep an eye on it. Some time passed. It wasn't very long, a few weeks. And we were lying in bed and heard 3 distinct knocks in our bathroom. You could hear the knocks inside the wall. At first, we thought, hey, it's the kids messing around. We told them to cut it out. And then it repeated later. And it would repeat when no one was in the house but me and her. So my wife kind of thought, oh, I'm going to respond back to it. I kind of get the feeling it might be my dad. Her dad had passed away a few years before that, and she always felt like his presence was near her. So in the bathroom, 3 knocks, and she knocked 3 times back, and it immediately responded. So I went over to the wall and did the Burma shave, the shave and a haircut, 2 bits. But I did the shave and a haircut, and the sound did the 2 bits. And I said, okay, we're dealing with something intelligent. So she decided she wanted to try to communicate. So she would ask it yes, no questions. 1 knock for yes, 2 for no. She would say, are you a spirit? Yes. Or we know you? Yes. That kind of thing. She continued to communicate with it. And I told her I was feeling uneasy about that because it didn't feel right to me. Frequently, I would wake up at 1, 2, and 3 o'clock in the morning to the sound of people talking, a murmur. I would get up, I would look around to see if, teenage boys, they're out messing around. No, everybody's in their bed. So where's that sound coming from? It was 3 distinct speech patterns I could pick up, but I could not make out what they were saying. It was nightly. I got to a point where I would turn on white noise to drown it out so I could sleep. I told my wife, and she's like, well, that's weird. That should only be my dad. I suspected it wasn't her dad from the start, and that was based on just my sense of dread. There was something, and I only have that feeling when I'm in the presence of something evil. It is definitely a malevolence that I can feel. Whatever this phenomenon that was occurring to us was, I said, I don't feel good about it. It's got me very uneasy. There's something not right about whatever this is, and it won't end the house. And when she's communicated with it, to the extent she did, she openly invited it in. We were sitting one night in bed watching TV, and she turned and looked at me and said, are you rubbing my hair? And I said, no. And I turned and looked, and I watched her hair swirl like somebody's finger was in her hair, but there was nothing there. There was no air conditioning on. There was no fan. There was no wind. Her hair literally was moving by itself. That's when we started seeing shadow figures. She got ready for work one night, and I was sitting in bed and talking to her while she was in the bathroom. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw this quick shadow go across the doorway, and it was the shape of a human. So I got off the bed and walked over to the doorway and looked over, and she's standing there putting her makeup on. And I said, did you just walk by the door? And she said, no. I said, well, I just saw a shadow walk by this doorway. At that point is when I took off my wedding band and I set it down on the counter, and I was making meatloaf for dinner. We're sitting there eating. I didn't put my ring back on yet. And while we were eating at the table, I literally heard what sounded like a ring being dropped on the wood floor. Just that ding, 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 ding. I got up and looked. My ring's not on the counter. We got on the floor. We looked. We moved everything. We moved the refrigerator. It was nowhere in there. Christine said, it'll turn up. It'll probably turn up. And we didn't think any more about it. I did find my wedding band a few weeks after the meatloaf incident. And it was in a boot that I had upstairs that I hadn't worn in years. I put my foot in it, and my wedding band was in the toe of the boot. No one put it there. We had a blended family. I had 3 kids, and she had 3 kids. All of them thought we were crazy. They didn't see, hear, feel anything. And we also started hearing what sounded like someone walking up our deck. At this point where the kids started hearing it. We were sitting in the living room and we could hear the footsteps and everybody was looking at each other saying, well, somebody's here. So they walked to the back door to turn the light on. Nobody was there. So they came back, got the light off, sat down. Now we heard it in the front. Okay, now the kids are smiling. So one went to one door, one went to the other door. They counted down, flicked the lights on, and both ran out because they were going to catch whoever it was, thinking it was one of their cousins playing a prank. There was nobody out there. So they come back inside and they were like really scared. They're like, y'all heard that, right? Somebody was walking on the deck. And I'm like, yeah, I heard it. So they locked the door. We're sitting still downstairs. Now we heard what sounded like somebody with heavy footfalls upstairs. And we knew nobody was upstairs. So they wanted to know, who is this? I said, this is what we've been trying to tell you. Something's going on. I've seen shadow people. And they were like, what do you mean shadow people? And I said, that's all I can describe. It looks like someone's shadow and there's no one there. It's just this darker shadow and it's moving and it looks to be the shape of a human being. My youngest son was still saying everybody was full of crap. He didn't believe it. My son started to argue that it wasn't his turn to do dishes one night. I said, no, you're going to wash dishes. And I was standing at the front porch smoking. And suddenly he ran out of the kitchen, past me, went racing up the stairs, went to his room and slammed the door. So I put out my cigarette, walked upstairs, went to his bedroom, and he was in the bed, covered up, and he said, I saw it. And I said, what did you see? He said, I saw it. And he described that he looked, and leaning against our freezer was a man about 6 foot tall, wearing overalls, but he could not make out any features of his face. And he crossed his arms and was looking at him. He's like, I didn't believe this stuff. I didn't believe this. And when I saw it, I just ran and it disappeared right in front of me. That pretty much set the stage for everybody having their own experience. Each one of them in turn had something happen. It was just around that same time that her son came to us and said, I finally saw it. And we said, well, what'd you see? And he said, I saw what looked like a man wearing overalls walking up the steps toward the bedrooms, except that he had long, thin arms. They were longer than normal. He said this wasn't just the shape of a person, that it was abnormally long. I saw his fingers long after his feet disappeared around the step. He was like, yeah, that we got to do something. This is not right. Something's not right here. Downstairs, we had a lamp, and that lamp at 2:00 every afternoon would turn on by itself. We thought, was it a power surge? No, you would literally hear click. It would turn on and it would stay on and you'd have to turn it off. Another event occurred upstairs, and my wife was getting ready for work again, and it was getting late, and I was, like I normally do, talking to her through the bathroom. And I saw this, and I can only describe it as the size of a softball, and it was light. I would call it an orb. It was blue-white light, and it rose from the foot of the bed and stopped midair directly in my field of vision, like it was looking at me. You could see this kind of whatever moving inside it. And when it disappeared over the foot of the bed, I jumped up and looked over, nothing there. So I'm like, we got to call somebody. This is getting outrageous. It was about this time that one of my wife's friends, she invited her to come over. And this lady considers herself to be a white witch. And when she walked up to the doorway of our home, she stopped and she said, I can't come in. And we were like, why not? She said, there's something in there. It's dark. I can't come in this house. And she literally left. And I looked at Christine and I said, I'm telling you, whatever this is, it's not your dad. After that, we were sitting in the living room a little bit past Christmas at that point. And my wife would often talk about her dad around Christmas time. And she had said that, she really missed him. And at that point, when she said that, the radio turned on and it was playing I Love This Bar. That was her dad's favorite song. We all were kind of like, big-eyed looking because we didn't have it plugged up. That radio had not been turned on in years. And Christine was utterly convinced at that point that it was her father. She 100% said, no, this is dad, this is dad, this is dad. During this whole time, I noticed also that she was progressively getting to a point where she would literally start to display like an aggravation, like she's just frustrated and aggravated and angry. And then she would lash out. Fights would break out for no reason. There were no reason for feeling the anger or the intensity of the anger. It made no sense whatsoever. The kids felt like a switch had flipped. Literally, she would become so agitated that you could visibly see her shaking. We called it vibrating. It normally ended in her saying something that would get me mad, and then I would say something that would make her mad. It was literally knowing exactly pinpoint which button to push on the other person to hurt them the worst. Something was making me angry. I would find myself just saying some of the crappiest things to her, and I would deliberately start a fight. And then we would get into this verbal back and forth and back and forth. It was very vicious bickering. It was exhausting. After the argument was over, we would both look at each other and go, why were we arguing? What was it about? We couldn't even answer that. It was just something made us angry at each other. And that's when I would tell her, whatever's doing this is taking our energy. Whatever's doing this is instigating this, and it's sucking this negativity. It's feeding on it. It's feeding on us. We got to get rid of this. But she was convinced that it was her father. And I'm like, that's not your dad. Your dad would not be doing that. Not to you, not to me, not to the kids. This is something else, and it's pretending. This kept going on till it culminated in an event when everything just goes to hell. We were having a really heated argument upstairs. She was in the bedroom on her side of the room, and it was back and forth and back and forth. And I'm like, we got to stop. We got to stop this. And she said, I'm not going to stop. I hate you. I wish I'd have never married you. And all of a sudden, and I'm standing 12, 15 feet away, I see her bow up like something just punched her in the stomach, and she went flying back into the closet. And I mean, her feet did not touch the ground, went flying and landed into the clothes and hit the wall. And I ran into her, and she said, something just punched me. And she's like, I don't know what this is. I don't know what this is. That was when she first finally acknowledged this ain't what she thought it was. Our fights continued until we finally said, we've had enough. Everything was just so destructive. Everyone was hurting. And the only thing to do was just leave. I said, I hope the best for you, but I can't live in this. And when I left, there was an immediate peace. Whatever it was did not follow me. It stopped. I think it did continue based on what I heard from her kids later and stuff. They mentioned that whatever it was followed their mom to her new home because stuff there started happening. So whatever it was did attach itself to my wife. I believe that whatever was in that home that created that situation led to the divorce. You know, no one wants to think that a ghost caused the problem. I still, blame myself, my trauma. But I think whatever that was utilized that to hasten the event. Definitely feel like that if we had not lived there, things may have turned out different.
As we wrap up our look into North Carolina witches, it's very clear that the line between folklore and reality is thinner and more haunting than we may think. On our next episode, we boldly go where no man has gone before and hear stories that make one thing clear: we are not alone.
I was on a bed that resembled a hospital bed, and I was on my side. I felt paralyzed, and I felt something behind my back, and I could move my neck. I turned around, and just a couple of inches from me, I came face to face with a gray who was standing there doing something to my back.
To learn more about the paranormal places and scary stories of North Carolina, visit ncfirstandfright.com. Discover trails and destinations that will haunt you in the best way, and share your own NC scare by tagging hashtag #NCFirstInFright. First in Fright is a production of Visit North Carolina, Lou Choir, and AYR Media. Hosted by me, Cooper Thornton. Executive producers Katie Bailey and Dana Grimstead for Visit North Carolina. Executive producers Nancy Landisberg, Michael Ashley, and Ryan Coleman for Lou Choir. Executive producer Eliza Rosen for AYR Media. Produced and written by Brandon Phibbs. Edited and mixed by Cameron Taggy. Casting producer Danielle Hillenbrand. AYR Media Coordinator Andy Levine. Voices by North Carolina storyteller Linda Gorham. Special thanks to Stacy for sharing his story. Special thanks from music from Vital, Ready to Teach, a production of 13 WNET.